Good morning. I see people are coming into the event. My colleague Adair Flores from Career Ladders Project is going to be making sure everybody has what they need to participate. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to put technical questions in the chat for Adair. I'm Linda Collins. I'm the founder and executive director of the Career Ladders Project. More on that later. I just want to say I'm so thrilled that you're joining us this morning. And we'd love it if, as you go in, as you're coming into the room, would you just drop in the chat your name, your college or what institution you're from? And then also, if you have 2 to 3 words that can tell us what brought you to work in the community colleges or with community colleges if you're an external partner, just drop that in the chat as people are continuing to come in. And I'm going to give it just a little bit of a few more minutes to let people come in and to see who's in our room. So please enter your name, your institution, and if you have just a couple words about your why. I see Lisa, Ashley. Lisa loves helping students reach their goals. Great. Please keep that coming as we get started. We would love to have a sense of who's in the room, and given the limitations of Zoom and time, we probably won't have a lot of unmuting of your microphones, but San Diego, Miramar, Hartnell, Open Access Mission, terrific. Well, you're in the right place. You're committed to student equity and success. That really is the topic for today. Our session today is on competency-based education, which is a flexible learning strategy and educational approach that can provide that kind of flexibility that many students really need to be able to complete their educational goals. So today's session, we're going to provide a bit of an overview of some different approaches to CBE that are underway now in the California community colleges. And also we will have time for Q&A towards the end. So before we go any further, I just want to introduce this incredible panel that has agreed to join us today. And next slide, Adair. We're really fortunate to have with us, I think, just some great innovative leaders of the California community colleges, and each of them in their own different spheres and ways are equity champions. First of all, I want to introduce Dr. Carlos Cortez. He is the president of San Diego Continuing Education. Before he came to San Diego, he was, I think, the acting VPI at Berkeley City College. And he has a long, illustrious history of working in many different levels in both public and private education. I think you started off as a Teach for America core member. You've also been an adjunct faculty at Johns Hopkins and New York University, UC Berkeley. So you've seen many different institutions and many different educational approaches. Carlos is also an extremely active leader in his community. And has a passion for social justice and urban education reform. I think you're on the Trevor Project, the board of the National Association of Community College Entrepreneurship, the Workforce Development Board there in your region, and so on, Goodwill, San Diego. So really, it's lovely to have you here. I know you've got many different things claiming your attention. I also want to introduce Jess, Guerra. Jess is the director of the Transportation Workforce Institute in the Los Angeles region, but it also, I think, has a national footprint. He's the executive director at that institute, and they really do aim to ensure a well-trained and diverse transportation workforce. Jess has also been the chair of the Advanced Transportation and Manufacturing Pathway at Los Angeles Trade Tech College, where Jess was really instrumental in leading the redesign of pathways there and introducing competency-based approaches to curriculum as a foundational element. And he's going to be sharing a lot more of that work with us today. We recently featured that work at LA Trade Tech in a document that we'll highlight just a little bit later in the presentation. Jess also serves as the chair of the California Council of Diesel Education and Technology and was on the board of directors of the Southern California Regional Transit Training Consortium and many other things. I think you were also a graduate of LA Trade Tech College and received a Full Circle Award by the Green Technology nonprofit, honoring somebody who started in community colleges and now is making such a contribution to the green future. Finally, I want to introduce Cheryl Aschenbach. Now, Cheryl is a member of the Executive Committee of the Academic Senate for California Community Colleges and is currently serving as the treasurer of the Academic Senate. Once long ago, I was on that same executive body, Cheryl, and I know it's a demanding job and one that really requires having a service orientation. So thank you, and thank the Senate for being here with us via you today. You, I think, also have represented, chair the Accreditation Committee of the Academic Senate, and also represented the Senate recently on the California Community College Safe Campus Reopening Workshop, and also represented the Senate on the California Community College Curriculum Committee, or 5Cs, that has recently undertaken very extensive work around competency-based ed. And she's going to share a lot of that work with us a little bit later. She also, I should say, serves on the Flexible Learning Approaches Advisory Committee to the California EDGE Coalition, which is researching the CBE landscape in California, and is in her other life an English and Communications faculty member at Lassen College, where I think you also, I don't know if you still are, but you have been local Senate president there as well. So thanks for all of that service, all of you. Next slide. For those of you who don't know Career Ladders Project, we are a nonprofit. We utilize the Foundation for California Community Colleges as our fiscal sponsor, and we essentially work on equity-minded community college redesign. We work directly with colleges across the state. Many of the colleges I see in the growing chat, we've worked with you, and we have spent quite a bit of time in the last few years working with colleges and with the system office on the design and implementation of guided pathways. And we really think that flexible learning and attention to the equity principles that need to underlie guided pathways is an essential conversation to be having in the state right now. And this workshop that we're doing today grows out of that concern. We had a small think tank of community college leaders and partners that helped us plan this today. Next slide. The workshop is really, this is the second in a two-part series. Last week, we heard from about research from the Community College Research Center, which really documented something I think most of us kind of in our gut knew or on the ground had observed, but it was important to see the data that really shows that our program enrollments and completions are very structured, very segregated and structured, really predictable by both race and gender. And we had a discussion with a great panel about what do we do about that? What does it mean? How do we address and interrupt structural racism and sexism in the California community colleges? Today, we're turning our attention more to the practical strategies. What are colleges, what can they do, and what are they doing to disrupt those disparities? So this workshop is focused on a particular strategy or set of strategies, competency-based ed. I know some of you are going to be old hands at this, and many of you are just new to the topic. So I just want to say, if you would, now that you've kind of introduced yourself on the chat, if you would go ahead and put in there, if you've brought certain questions or things you're hoping to find out to this workshop, please start putting them in the chat. We'll keep track of those and try to address as many as we can before the end of the time. But if we don't get to it, then we'll also use it as a way to get back to you and find additional ways to provide material. Next slide. Today, we're focused on competency-based ed. And I want to say, while it's a strategy and educational approach that can provide flexibility, that really meets students where they are and generally allows them to progress at their own pace and demonstrate mastery directly, rather than simply by traditional course means. The question is up, what are we going to do about it? It's a nascent movement really in California. Though there's some people here on the call that have done a lot of work in the past, it hasn't yet reached a systemic level in the California community colleges. So as we go, we want to feature a number of different approaches. It's not a uniform body of work by any means, and there's a lot of potential. And one of the questions is what is the potential that it holds for more equitably serving students in our community colleges? Next slide. We recently at CLP, as I mentioned, published a case study and a short discussion guide that you might find helpful if you're starting to have these conversations on campus. I'm going to draw on those a little today. And also it outlines some of the work that Jess Guerra is going to be talking about. But I also want to point out that there's just growing attention in the policy and advocacy sphere to competency-based ed. The governor put encouragement for us to do competency-based education in the 2021 state budget language. And a number of advocates and allies have recently lifted up CBE as an area that the state should encourage. California Competes has recently issued, I think, a very helpful short comparison of credit for prior learning and competency-based education. It's about 5 pages, very helpful. The California Edge Coalition is currently doing a landscape of CBE efforts and interest in California, and will be making by the end of the year a number of policy recommendations. And similarly, Ed Trust West, a great partner, has been just recently lifted up in a paper called Californians Deserve Credit, Recognizing All Learning to Help California Achieve Educational and Racial Equity. Those are all linked in the slide deck, but Adair is also going to be putting them in the chat for you in case that's helpful. And finally, for those of you who are really new and looking for a way in, I recommend that you take a look at the Competency-based Ed Network. They have a lot of great materials there. Next slide. I'm not going to go into this too much because I want the speakers to talk to us about what they're really doing. But in the discussion guide that we mentioned, you can find materials that kind of give a sense of what's different about CBE and the current model. And mainly the issue is that they're assessed, skills are assessed not at the course level at the end, but rather skills are assessed at the program level, often with key milestones. And competencies are mapped out throughout the pathway, not necessarily just in a separate course. CBE models can be course-based, which Jess, I think, will talk about, or they can be direct assessment-based, which Cheryl's going to talk about. But in any case, learning mastery is the focus of CBE. Next slide. I mentioned two distinguishing kinds. The direct assessment, which is really not time-bound. Its completion is determined by mastery, and students can progress as mastery is demonstrated. And only after the fact are credit hour equivalencies applied to student learning outcomes. And again, Cheryl's going to go over that. Course-based is more integrating or incorporating competencies into course and program student learning outcomes, but may also be done within an academic term and a course or program set of requirements. So you may keep that in mind as we go forward. Also, competency-based approaches can be done in both credit, as Cheryl's going to talk about, or in non-credit offerings, as Carlos is going to be talking about. In all cases, the aim is to provide students with more flexibility and ways to demonstrate progress and mastery as they go. And it's this flexibility that many believe holds promise for equity, but we'll see, will it deliver? It's enough for me, so let's just get started. I know, Carlos, you're focusing on non-credit approaches to CBE in the work at San Diego Continuing Ed. So why don't you tell us about that? What's going on? What's the potential? Where are you headed?
Carlos, you're muted.
That's a great start. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Linda, very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. It's an honor to have been requested to speak with everyone this morning and to be part of this distinguished panel. I have to attest that during the process of preparing for our presentation, I realized that I'm probably, as is generally the case, not the best person to speak on this topic. But as we worked towards preparing for this presentation, was learned that in an informal capacity, we've been doing this type of work in the non-credit sphere, really since the birth of non-credit. And I will share that before we embarked on the current approach to developing competency-based education, I advocated for using non-credit as a tool for implementing competency-based education and credit for prior learning, CPL. So that's the other acronym that's often used in a parallel fashion with CBE, CPL. I serve again as the president of San Diego Continuing Education. I think I have slides, don't I? I'm sorry, I'm supposed to say next slide maybe. I think that was the instructions. Okay, there we go. So competency-based education on credit. Next slide, please. Let's talk a little about my organization so you understand the context of what I mean by using non-credit for credit. San Diego Community College District is that brown circle there. That circle is divided three ways by three colleges: City College, Miramar College, and Mesa College. But continuing education services all three of those service areas. So the entire city of San Diego. There's 7 campuses that make a ring around the map here, and over 200 offsite locations that we provide programming at. We have a 5-member elected board. We can go to the next slide, please. These here are the 3 colleges, next slide, that enroll 60,000 students per year. In addition to the 60,000 students that the 3 colleges enroll per year, over 40,000 students enroll per year at continuing education. And that's the list there of the 7, we call them campuses. It's technically 5 centers with 2 satellites, but for our students' understanding, it's 7 campuses. What's unique about our community is that whereas throughout California, the primary feeding pool for community colleges is K-12 system. It's 12th graders moving into community college. In San Diego, it's our continuing education division. So it's like the middle school moving into the high school in our community, whereas in the K-12 district coming in is the second feeder. Move forward, please. Next slide. We've been around for over 100 years, huge immigrant population. We are a border institution on the border of Mexico. ESL and citizenship are our earliest class offerings, and they are large. When I started, right before President Trump was elected, about 44% of our FTES was ESL. As a result of all the shifts in immigration, that's down to about 32%. But it's still a large chunk of the students we serve. More than 2/3 of our students, English wasn't their first language, and more than half of our students were born outside of the United States. We also have the most diverse zip code in our service area, the most diverse zip code in the world in terms of origins of birth, country origins of birth. Move forward, please. Next slide. Whereas we are in our district, not a provider of credit programming, our 3 colleges hand off non-credit contract education, fee-based education, and community education, which falls under my purview. And these are pretty large enterprises in our district compared to most other districts. And that's not included, of course, in our 40,000 head count. So there's another several thousand students that are enrolled in these programs as well, because it's not part of our FTES generating number. And just to give a general idea of who we are, we are I think still the largest non-credit program in the state, based on the last data point I've seen. We have been for the last several years. Mount SAC is now hovering nearby us, and San Francisco used to be the institution that hovered by us in terms of enrollment. But we're not the largest CSL. We're not the largest citizenship. We're not the largest high school diploma. We are the largest in every single one, in all but one of our 75 plus job training certificate programs. And that's really what sets us apart. It's what we do in the non-credit job training space that isn't typically done in non-credit by other districts up and down the state. And particularly in terms of the rigor, programs like Python coding, cybersecurity, CNA, welding, HVAC, plumbing, automotive, auto body, mobile app development, Cisco networking, A+, a whole variety of core offerings. Next slide, please. And I should say, with respect to the last slide, those 4 different types of programs, we need to remember, I think, always as a community college system, that whereas credit is, 93% of our FTES generating courses, and really is what we're known for, these other students are our students in contract and fee-based and community education. That's why I always put them on the table, because conversations like competency-based education and credit for prior learning apply to those populations too. And although we typically think of fixes on how to serve FTES generating students, particularly in our district, these are a significant proportion of the audience or the clientele that we serve. Okay, so again, as we are known as a leader in workforce development. Fast forward, next slide, please. So we are first in the state for 75 plus, and I mean by size, in strong in career training education certificates. We have also been a leader in our region and at the state level in terms of strong workforce outcomes. That's job placement and certificate completion. And our focus, which I think sets us aside and has really transformed our organization in the last 5 to 10 years, has been a moving away from programs like medical coding, which pay a minimum wage salary, to programs like medical unit worker, who's the person that triages you in the emergency room, who makes $50,000 to $80,000 a year, where medical coding is a skill set that person needs. We're thinking more advanced skill programs that lead to higher wages and sustainable opportunities. Next. Here are the 9 pathways, guided pathways at continuing ed that house our 75 certificate programs. Next. And then opportunity to formalize CBE and CPL. So if you can fast the next slide, please. I think there's one more. So here's where we've had challenges. And the main challenges we've had is that in the non-credit space, we already provide credit for prior learning in competency-based education. Let me give an example. ESL. In ESL, we have 3 certificates like most of your colleges do: early, intermediate, advanced. If a student comes in to early ESL, there's 3 courses: ESL 1, 2, and 3. If they test in to ESL 2, they get credit for ESL 1. That's competency-based education. That's credit for prior learning. Yeah, both are built in there. The same is true if somebody comes to our automotive program, our technician program. We have 5 certificate programs from beginner to advanced. And within each of these levels, I think it's an auto 1, 2, 3, up to 5. Within each of these programs, before you enroll, there's an orientation. And if you disclose that you've been working in the industry, then you have a conversation with the faculty member. And in that conversation, there in some cases, there are assessments, like in our office skills programs. There's even assessments that folks can take where they can test out of Excel or test out of PowerPoint. So competency-based education and credit for prior learning happen in the non-credit space. And when students complete certificates, they still get that certificate of achievement. They still get that state-approved certificate program, which in our district, in many cases, this is the important connection, in many cases, our non-credit programs transfer for credit to our credit colleges. And so that there is the pathway that I believe can help colleges to really quite easily implement the non-credit to credit pathway for implementation of CPL or CBE. In other words, creating parallel programs in the non-credit space where students can, through CBE and CPL, test out of mandates to get the certificates they need that then articulate through credit by exam with the credit colleges for credit. So for example, let's go back to our auto program. Our auto program, students who complete that program can take up to 24 units to Miramar College in their auto AS degree in automotive. So most of their advanced major courses are actually completed at continuing education in the non-credit space. Our faculty work closely together. I see here we have a faculty member from Miramar's auto program in our presentation. So I hope I'm not misspeaking, but they have a very positive relationship, is my understanding, across program areas. And that allows us to have these strong pathways between institutions. So in a nutshell, now I will say I was recently reading that Calbright College is developing a competency-based education approach to instruction. And I have emails out to try to learn more. But I learned this just a couple days ago in an article by Ashley Smith and EdSource, where they talked about how they're implementing or formalizing, I should say, a competency-based education approach for non-credit. And that was part of the intention of launching Calbright. Now, what I don't understand, and maybe I have a lot of experts in the room that have a lot more knowledge than me, is most or all of the work I've seen happening at the state level around competency-based education has been focused on credit course offerings. I haven't seen any of the trainings, or I have gone, and many administrators and faculty from my organization have attended some of the statewide convenings on the implementation of CBE. And every time I attend or someone reports back, they say non-credit's still not at the table, which for those that work in the non-credit sphere know that that's not atypical. That often happens with us. And the reason I say formalize this process is because we just launched what is called ICOM Academy. This is our interactive competency-based online micro-credentialing academy, and it's the fully online division of our organization, which we've been working to develop for the past 5 years. And we have 15 certificates, 40 plus courses that are fully online, child development, automotive, digital media, IT, and business courses. And we are adding, we continue to add to it. We'll have another 5 certificates by the end of spring. It is difficult for us to engage in competency-based education in the way we have done so historically when we're working in this new dynamic online environment. And I should say these are all synchronous programs, face-to-face programs. Laboratories are built online, and students are required to engage in collaborative work outside of class. And so waiving requirements, we haven't begun to implement CBE and CPL the way we've done in a brick and mortar fashion through our new online delivery. And this translates over outside of ICOM Academy to all the other programs we're offering online because of COVID. And so there is a real desire on our part to try to formalize how we go about this work for non-credit. And that's why I'm happy we have the Academic Senate here with us today. And I think I saw someone representative here from Calbright as well. Maybe she can give us some insights as to work that's happening in this regard, because it's extremely important in the non-credit space. They're coming to us for short-term intensive job training. We don't want to waste their time. If we can avoid having them relearn knowledge or information they already know, it is in both of our best interests to move them quickly into employment or quickly to transition them into our credit college program. So that's all I have. I apologize. I don't really have a lot of other nuance or insights, but we do this on a daily basis across dozens and dozens of programs, but it's done mostly in an informal basis unless faculty themselves have created their own or are using industry sort of assessments to measure what students know and don't know.
Thank you so much, Carlos. And more to be discussed, I'm sure, as people begin to put more questions. I'm seeing some comments sort of saying, bravo, thank you, wow. They didn't know the extent, particularly of the non-credit and continuing education offerings that the colleges have. So thank you. Jess, I think let's turn to you. I know while Carlos has talked about the work on the non-credit side, you've been doing work over at LA Trade Tech for many years on the credit side. So why don't you let us know?
Sure. Thank you, Linda. And thanks again for inviting me to be a part of this great panel. Next slide, please. And I think that's still San Diego. That next slide. Next slide. And that's where we start. So let's go to the very first slide. One more slide, please. Okay, so I'll start my discussion just really talking about what was the catalyst for competency-based education at LATTC. And you know, so for us, CBE has its roots back in 2010, 2011 academic year, when we just decided as a college that we were going to move into a pathways model. And this is before, you know, guided pathways was a thing. So there wasn't a whole lot of you know, models to really follow, and we had to, you know, really kind of build it from the ground up, and all of this was driven because at that time, you know, our student success scorecard metrics, you know, just really were sounding an alarming bell. We were at the bottom of the list when we took a look at what our completion rates were, our retention, and all of these things at the state level. And we wanted to find a way to, you know, bring these numbers up, increase student success, and so on. So when we started the work of pathways, how we grouped pathways together was by looking at programs that shared common competencies within them. So as we started looking at the programs and started looking at program competencies, that took us to deeper conversations of saying, well, what does the ideal pathway look like, right? Is it one where the students come in, they take a common core of courses, and then they're able to spring out to maybe, you know, one program, maybe lattice into another, et cetera. So all of that is really what was the catalyst for us to take a look now at really at a programmatic level, looking at competency-based education. So next slide, please. In a very similar way to how we came up with our pathway design, when we started going into the programmatic component and how we were going to develop these credit-based programs into competency-based, we had our 6-step implementation process. And I'll kind of go through this kind of quickly. I'll be referring back and forth to them because I really want to get more into the meat of the process and what that looks like. But it started, number one, we had to prepare. We had to align our goals, identify what these were, who are the stakeholders, you know, what are the targeted industries. You know, we had to select what were the programs that we were going to launch this in. And, you know, that included both internal and external stakeholders. We also had to do the research behind it, taking a look at the occupations. You know, what was the job outlook? What are the emerging trends in a particular occupation? And then one interesting piece is, as we're really landscaping, what are all of the occupations that a particular program would prepare a student for? You know, there are those that are very apparent, and then there are those occupations that are not so apparent. And an example that I always use is collision repair, right? So we have a collision repair program at our campus. And as educators, when we think about collision repair and a student coming over to take a collision repair program, we think, hey, that's somebody who probably wants to, you know, start a career in, you know, auto body repair, paint, etc. We don't always think that perhaps this person is going to go work for Allstate, you know, have a close touch and a close exposure, early exposure to industry. And then, of course, then once that's completed, number 5, we launch the program. And number 6, which is interesting because I'll come back to this one, I'll give you a perfect example of this one as we move on, is on evaluating and consistent review and revision of student success and industry feedback, right? So constant evaluation. So we go through this entire process, it's complete, but then as soon as it's complete, we go right back to it again. So that we can make sure that it goes on and on. Next slide, please. So I want to share with you an example of a program that we have really taken, kind of picked apart and put back together in a different format. And that was our diesel technology program. What you see in this image, and I know that the image maybe not as clear or as easy to read at detail level, but Linda referred to the case study that they did on some of the work that we've been doing on competency-based education. So there's a much more detailed explanation there, also of our college, our demographics, etc., which is why I didn't go into it. But anyway, this competency framework that you see before you here, this is what we came up with. This was kind of the end product of what we came up with when we really dug deep into identifying the competencies that students would need in order to complete the diesel and related technology program. One of the key components is that, recall that I mentioned that the catalyst for all of this was that we were moving into pathways, right? So when we started moving into pathways, we started at the point of at ground zero of saying, when a student sets foot for the very first time at LATTC, what are those core competencies that they will need in order to be successful, in their program of study, regardless of what program they're going into, right? So the bottom two tiers that you see there, the foundational competencies for college and career success, and academic and career readiness competencies, those were core competencies that we had adopted at the college level, that we said, it doesn't matter what program you're going into, this is core. You need this so that you can be successful. Then you build on top of that some common employability competencies. And there's a lot of research that went into this, a lot of external sources and vetting, but that's where you come up with personal skills, with teamwork, with communication, with some of those aspects that are just common employability competencies. On top of there, now you start getting into the industry. So if you're going into the transportation industry, and remember, this is for diesel and related technology, right? So this is the heavy equipment, the trucks, the buses, the rail, all of that. It doesn't matter if you're just going into transportation, what are those industry-wide competencies that you need? For instance, knowing how, general safety, a realistic view of the industry, right? Sometimes students would come in, they sign up to a program because it sounds like a good job, or their uncle or their cousin or someone referred them, but do they really know the industry? This particular industry, this is a 365 a day a year, 24-hour a day type of industry, having all of these things. And then a lot of the, test taking skills, everything else. Then it builds to the next layer, which is the occupation specific. And this is now where they're going into the technical components. And then finally, specialty competencies, right? So we end up with this big framework. And these are all of these competencies that they need to have. Next slide, please. Just to give you a sense, you see a red box in this slide. For that red box, that was the information technology and information digital literacy competency. So for each one of those boxes, we had to identify, what does that mean? If we're saying that a student needs to have a certain level of information technology and digital literacy, what does that look like, right? Well, you have a whole explanation for each one of those boxes. Being able to use a computer, knowing how to scroll using keyboards, and how to interact, email, using having a certain sense of information literacy, digital literacy. And then finally, the biggest piece is, sometimes it's easy to identify the needs, but then how do you assess it, right? And where were we going to build these in? So as we looked at a program that was going to be now fully competency based, or led by these competencies, there are some of these competencies that are not generally part of a program of study. Like for instance, the reason why I chose this one, the information technology, if you came into the diesel technology program, we don't necessarily put on a computer class, right? At the general level. So, but we also identified that this is a core competency that students need. So how do we give them that? So in this case here, we launched, there's a number of strategies and we probably don't have enough to cover all of them, but one of them is called the Pathway Ready. And this is like an onboarding into the program. It's a 2-week bridge right before the semester starts, where we try to give where we try to give them some, some information and give them some of the core training that they need and be able to assess the competencies. Next slide, please. So I'll go through a few quick steps. First of all, in order to develop the instructional roadmap, you need faculty engagement and participation. And this meant bringing all of the program faculty to the table. It meant getting buy-in. It meant having the faculty own this. And also allowing industry recognized certifications to lead the process. So we could develop and identify competencies, but they don't mean a whole lot if they don't align to existing industries recognized certifications where these are available. In some places they weren't available. For instance, in rail, they weren't. So we had to go to other groups like the American Public Transportation Association. They had developed standards and they've gone through a level of vetting. So we have to find something that's a guide. Sharing this framework with advisory committees and then all other industry groups. And then finally, the curricular enhancement and design. Next slide, please. So let's talk about what works. We developed this program, we developed this competency framework. What really works is that now you have a roadmap with competency and assessment criteria where there's a clear set of expectations for both students and industry. There are built-in strategies for accelerating and for credit for prior learning. How we do a lot of that is by credit by examination. Also, we took all of our classes in those programs and we put everything online as if they were online classes so that they could have full online support. We also broke them away from semesters into trimesters to be able to allow students to move and not be bound for an entire semester to one class if they meet that level of competency. And then of course, you end up with a student-centered program that trains for multiple occupations. Next slide, please. Here's what needs work. One, there is no standard CBE strategy. We're one college that's part of a 9-college district, huge college district. And when you're one in one of 9, it's hard to drive this change. The other component is that everything still revolves around the Carnegie unit. So how we grant units, how we pay faculty, the assignments, everything still revolves around it. And that always tends to box us in. And then the other component is also that most of the CBE efforts are made to fit within the existing college educational structure. So if you look, for instance, at our course outline, it wouldn't readily be apparent. Next slide, please. And then finally, the last few things we'll look at, and I'm not going to get into a whole lot of this, but we are looking at continuing to re-examine the competencies, badging, and modularizing some of the curriculum. And the big item is removing time. And I'll conclude by saying that we talked about step 6 was to relook at everything and reassess. One of the results of that is that now we went from diesel technology to heavy duty truck, transit, and equipment. And that's because industry's recommendation. So it's a work in progress, and I'm happy to share more during the Q&A session.
Thank you so much, Jess. That's really impressive and thorough. And, you know, I think showing how it can be done within a current 4-credit program, but also noting that you bump up against these structural barriers and particularly the Carnegie unit. So I know those are some of the questions that are really on people's minds when they think about direct assessment competency-based and some of the work that the system is embarking on. So Cheryl, let us know what you think and what's going on out there.
Fantastic. Thank you, Linda. And thank you, Jess. I think Jess's couple slides about what they bumped up to, having to uh, be restrained by the Carnegie unit hour, be restrained by semesters and traditional terms. That time piece, certainly any of us right now can design with competency-based education within our courses or within our programs. And Jess's example at Trade Tech is an excellent example of really thinking through a program designed around competencies. But in order to really move this and have more of an impact in terms of equity and flexibility that so many of our students, particularly our adult students, need, we definitely need some systemic changes. So next slide, please. Last fall, I was fortunate last year as a member of the Senate's Executive Committee to co-chair the California Community Colleges Curriculum Committee, or 5C, and it's a body that's charged with making recommendations ultimately to the Chancellor's Office and the Board of Governors around curriculum. And so we were approached with, what do you think about exploring this and potentially developing some regulatory language so that we perhaps can reframe and make possible and remove some of the barriers that Jess has referred to. And so in spring 2020, that committee did start its effort. We had an objective to engage in deep learning around competency-based education so that ultimately we could identify regulatory barriers and then create a package of regulatory language to be able to implement statewide, specifically direct assessment CBE, and I'll talk about that in a moment, and as well as identify next steps. And so tremendous amount of collaboration. 5C was the committee that this engaged with, and it's important to note that the 5C committee includes faculty, 8 academic senate representatives, and in fact, as curriculum in our system is purview of faculty, this committee is majority faculty, but we are absolutely partnered with our chief instructional officers, our vice presidents of instruction, who have 4 representatives on the committee, a voice from non-credit represented from ACE, the Association of Community and Continuing Education, kind of the professional non-credit organization in our state, a representative from CTE appointed by the California Community Colleges Association for Occupational Educators. We have a classified professional because our curriculum technicians and support specialists play a critical role in the detail of curriculum in our system, particularly in submission to the Chancellor's Office and in ensuring that we're all locally complying with regulation. And then multiple Chancellor's Office staff members, both as voting members of the committee in 2 cases, as well as resources constantly, folks coming in as it pertains to their roles at the Chancellor's Office. And so this committee meets monthly and already does quite a bit of work on behalf of the system. But to take on this challenge, we realized that this needed to be a broader effort. We had a conversation last fall about, just is a CBE module a course or is it not a course? And because as a committee, we realized we had so little common understanding, we spun on that question for an hour and a half and still didn't have an answer. And so we realized that deep learning piece was really important. If we as a committee were tasked with creating this regulatory package, then we needed together to have a much better understanding of what CBE is, as well as what the potential was for our students. And so the Chancellor's Office, the Foundation for California Community Colleges, specifically the Student Success Center and the Policy Center within that, they played a role because they're experts in developing and shaping policy. We use JFF, Jobs for the Future, as facilitators for this effort, as well as they brought in some of the external readings and information that helped us engage in that learning. And then they helped to facilitate some of the conversations as we shaped the regulations. And then it was critical, and I'll cover this a little bit more on the next slide, that we have a couple of experts. One, again, none of us were experts on CBE. We were learning as a group. And so we did employ a contractor or a consultant rather in competency-based education, Dr. Lori Dodge from Brandman University, who is well known within the CBE circles as a mover, shaker, and really a leader in this effort. And then an equity expert who came from University California Riverside, Dr. Eddie Como, and really it was important for us to center these efforts around equity. Next slide, please. And so as we, as a committee, started our learning in January and through February, and then started some of the regulatory development, we, on the left side here, really had some guiding frameworks, things that really guided our work. First and foremost, that equity needed to be the central goal. We needed to design around equity, not figure out how to adjust something for equity. We needed to make very apparent that we needed to support access, persistence, and completion for our students. that what we intended to develop was had to be centered around intentional, transparent, and meaningful competencies. And I think Jess's competencies are a great example of that, that they're influenced by industry and standards within industry and needs within industry, and then, you know, shaped, the curriculum shaped very intentionally around that. Everything we did, we had to remember that the student was at the center, and that we were aiming for anytime, anywhere learning, that flexibility was key. We needed to break away from the concept of time in instruction. We needed centered around that equity, culturally responsive pedagogy, recognizing that we do teach diverse learners, both across race and ethnicity, socioeconomic status, as well as age. And that to do this right, we needed to have equity-minded data collection and evaluation as an aspect of the process. On the right-hand side, some of our early assumptions or just frameworks for developing the regulations were, as has been said, student learning and equity at the focus. We centered on direct assessment CBE. And as Linda pointed out earlier, there's multiple forms of CBE. Direct assessments recognized in Title IV for financial aid federally. And so that was an important element. We needed to have something that was federally eligible for financial aid. Our students depend on that in so many cases. And it is the form of CBE that allows for the maximum amount of flexibility. The credit-based CBE is possible. And as Jess has pointed out, it can be done within our existing structures, although it's, you know, it's difficult to do and there are still problems. The direct assessment is meant to really break all the traditional bounds that we operate within and, you know, ultimately aiming for the most amount of flexibility. And so we needed to make sure too that program and module quality standards aligned with those of degree programs and degree applicable credit courses. We from the start aimed to have a focus on credit. And I know that Carlos and our non-credit colleagues weren't thrilled about that, but starting, I think, at the biggest, hardest task was the intention of the committee, and then working into certificates and including non-credit is all part of the longer picture as we talked about it. We were approaching competency-based education as an alternative instructional methodology, just as in our regulations, online instruction is an alternative methodology. Cooperative work experience is an alternative methodology, really recognizing, and the Chancellor's Office uses this language often, that we're looking at adding another tool to our instructional toolboxes across the state. Traditional instruction, whether it's online or face-to-face, is serving many of our students well. But the reality is it's not serving all of our students, that there are many who are failed by it. And so for those that perhaps need a different structure, a different instructional approach, CBE is intended to be that other approach or an other approach. And so it really, you know, the regulations were developed with the intention of including it in the alternative instructional methodologies in Title V. We looked at, instead of our traditional curriculum is developed with courses, then built into programs and approved and submitted that way, or submitted and approved that way, we instead were looking at really program design, and that everything was about the CBE level program, and then modules rather than courses built within it. Modules not undergoing separate approval, it really was important that the entire program be packaged and approved in that way. And then using national models for grading and transcripts as we worked on the regulations, the idea that we're not looking at traditional A, B, C, D, F grading, instead looking at mastery as the expectation, and then using transcripts, both the competency transcript as the core transcript, but then also having the credit hour or credit equivalent transcript that is necessary, at least still, for students to be able to transfer to our four-year partners or to be better understood perhaps in workforce situations. Next slide, please. So as we looked at direct assessment CBE, we did develop a definition for our system, largely based on the definition from the Competency-based Education Network, but influenced by a couple of others and definitely influenced by our expectation for equity. And so we were looking at an intentional outcomes-based and equity-minded approach to earning a college degree, in which expectations of learning are held constant, you know, that same standard as we have now, but time is variable and the program's flexible, self-paced, including high-touch and innovative learning practices. We already can do some of this within our courses and programs. And in non-credit, Carlos has demonstrated that. In credit, Jess has demonstrated that. It's not uncommon for CTE programs in particular to already have elements of CBE where they're really designed intentionally around core competencies. But to be able to have the flexibility, again, that's where we needed the regulations to change in some cases, or to have another package of regulations as an option. And so really looking at moving from the language of courses and programs to modules within a degree and competencies and sub-competencies. So changing that language so that it's clear when we're talking about CBE, the language is distinct and easier to figure out. And ultimately, again, that instructional option, that CBE will be great for some students, and it will provide access and flexibility that some of our learners need, or traditional instruction, whether online or face-to-face, it will continue to meet the needs of many of our learners. Next slide, please. So because we're talking about this in the context of guided pathways, I wanted to touch on the guided pathways pillars, or the principles that we're creating clear curricular pathways to employment and further education. And I think when you see how Jess's program was designed, absolutely creating very clear pathways, and those pathways being centered around the competencies necessary for particular industries and ancillary industries as well. Helping students choose and enter their pathway. When we talk about competency-based education, that will be critical. Intake and really helping students figure out if a more self-paced assisted program that's flexible and adjust as they need it to meets their needs, or for some students does the traditional where the institution determines the time and the pacing, and you're working with an instructor in a more traditional format, will that meet their needs? So helping those students choose and enter their pathway, and whether that pathway is competency-based or traditional credit-based will be an important aspect of implementing CBE across our system. Helping students stay on the path is a very intentional part of direct assessment CBE programs when they're delivered, that the student does work in the programs that are out there a little bit more independently, but with regular contact from instructors as well as support staff and in many different roles, that the student services support really is intentionally built in. And our institutions in California have been talking about that with the guided pathways framework. But this really takes that built-in, surrounding, embedded to a much different level. And it becomes this one-on-one partnership between a student and an instructor, and between the student and support staff to help that student progress through and identify needs and meet those needs and continue to progress through. And then ultimately ensuring that learning is happening with intentional outcomes, again, because competency-based education is designed specifically around really clear competencies and sub-competencies. Right now we use learning outcomes, but we tend to attach those to our courses in many cases. This instead is designing around those outcomes from the very start, and then measuring against those outcomes and having, as Jess pointed out, those constant conversations with industry and our advisory committees, and looking at national standards around a particular role or industry or position, and adjusting through those evaluation processes. So CBE and guided pathways fit very well together. And so it's a natural outreach as an option for students. Next slide, please. So next steps, colleges are working together. The Chancellor's Office is launching a direct assessment CBE collaborative with the intention of having, I think it's 6 to 8 or 7 colleges who partake and ultimately collaborate together to get this effort going, recognizing this is a heavy lift. The regulations have been approved by the Board of Governors at the meeting earlier this week after a second review. And so those will begin to be put into place, which then gives colleges a chance to start to design. Next slide, please. And I'm going to keep moving because I know we're running short on time. So in this collaborative, the Chancellor's Office has worked very intentionally to design it in a bit of a CBE format, working within modules and having competencies and deliverables within each of those modules. And again, most of this will be done both within a college and across the participating colleges, with the idea that as we establish this new frontier and really work through some of these challenges in those colleges that are implementing, they have partners in this effort and thought partners and assistants. And it isn't just about instruction. This will impact our financial aid offices, our business offices, our counseling offices, our intake offices. And so in so many different ways to be able to work with folks in the similar roles across the participating colleges. We're hoping that these collaborative colleges then can be our early adopters using the new framework and the new regulations, and then can also turn around and assist other colleges as the rest of the system starts to implement some CBE. Again, as an option, not replacing. All right, next slide, please. So I think that takes us to questions. And Linda, I know you just prompted if there's questions, please put them in the chat, whether they're for me or Carlos or Jess. We'd be happy to spend a few more minutes answering them.
I guess I should unmute myself. One question I had is, I know that the colleges that are interested can step forward with a expression of interest in joining the collaborative that you mentioned. Is it too late for colleges to do that? Can they fill out the form yet still?
I think it was extended into I think that into next week even.
Okay.
Still trying to get that interest. So a survey did go out to the CEOs, the CIOs, chief instructional officers, as well as I think academic senate presidents, with the intention of one submission per college, with the expectation that those 3 individuals on a campus, at least at the very start, all need to support the idea of at least showing interest. And so it's not a commitment yet. There's an application process, but the idea to gauge interest, grab those that are interested, or express that interest, and then start a little bit of education about what that application process will look like. But the entire timeline is bringing colleges in the spring and working with ultimate implementation. I think it's by 2023. So recognizing it's going to take some time to develop this ultimately and have students hit the ground with it. But at the same time, in a recent Chancellor's Office webinar, colleges don't only have to go through the collaboratives. Some certainly can choose to undertake parts of this effort on their own. But using the collaborative really allows for a little bit more, thinking together and problem solving together.
Mm-hmm. Great. I had Adair put in the chat a link to that interest form, as well as a webinar that was held not too long ago by Chancellor's Office staff for those who were interested in joining the collaborative. So we put the link in there in case that's something you want to follow up with. And we also put the link to the JFF published modules that you mentioned. So we do have some questions coming up. One here is from Joe Young, and he's asking, is there a specific source of funding for this type of program? More to the point, is there more money in going this route versus the traditional unit-based funding model? Big question. Cheryl and
I'll jump in a little bit. In terms of, for the collaborative effort, there is money available to the participating colleges. But I don't think that's ultimately your question. Is there more money in it for colleges that offer CBE versus traditional? And that still remains to be seen. To be honest, the funding structure for CBE hasn't been established by the Chancellor's Office division yet. They're looking at, will the traditional unit equivalents and cost per unit apply, or will there be a different format? That's yet to be determined. I think as 5C talked about it, finances, it wasn't really our arena. We work with curriculum. But I think there was an intention to not have this be financially advantaged or disadvantaged in any way, that if it really is meant to be an outcome on par with our traditional outcomes, a degree, that the cost to students should be comparable, as well as the cost or benefit to institutions be comparable, so that we're making a curriculum-based decision to participate that's ultimately best for students, rather than a financial-based decision because it's best for the institution.
Mm-hmm. Carlos, did you have any thoughts about funding models for CBE?
With respect to credit, we're funded on a positive attendance model. Aside from the exceptions made during the COVID closure, and so there really is no implications for positive resource development, because if the students waive out of an expectation, we waive the opportunity to collect apportionment for that educational experience. That said, it helps our students to get to the finish line more quickly, and we can claim completion, and that has implications on strong workforce revenue. And so there are other positive benefits. Again, we have very high success rates when these students transition to credit, and a significant number of them do transition to our credit program. So there's a lot of other wins, but specifically around apportionment, there is no win in non-credit at this time. That could potentially change, however, with some of the work that's being done around the state, including advocacy on my end, and many of my non-credit colleagues, to move how we apportion non-credit towards census-based apportionment, away from positive-based attendance for managed enrolled CDCP courses.
So it seems like there's not an answer to this question of Joe's, but it is up because, for example, with direct assessment, if you move away from the Carnegie unit, I think you were the one, Jess, that said everything is tied to it. Faculty load, apportionment, grade transcripts, everything. So it is it holds the potential, particularly in what you're talking about, Cheryl, is kind of shaking up a lot of assumptions and structures in order to be able to do CBE. And then how would we fund it? If we move further in this direction, it'll definitely be a question. I also see earlier a question about the student experience. And I'm just curious, maybe Carlos or Jess, if you've seen, what do you think is different about the student experience when you approach learning from a competency base?
I'll start off if that's okay. I think for us, what's different from the student experience is that at our college, primarily being career education, we're 75% career education. We get a lot of students that come in that have already some level of experience. We get a lot of veterans that are returning in. So when they come in and they see the opportunity to advance in the program and maybe come in and just do credit by exam for the first few basic courses because maybe they have military experience, as opposed to maybe 6 years ago where we would make them sit through a mechanics 101 course where they're learning about rulers and tool names and things like that. So I think from their experience, a couple things that are different. One, any experience, whether it's documented or informal experience that they may have, could be valued. That's one. And then two, because of the way that the classrooms have been set up and the coursework has been set up, they have this online component, the lecture, everything set up for them online, very much in the way that you would have a flipped classroom. So it does give those that may need some repetition, an opportunity to go back, review lectures, and gain some of the knowledge.
Carlos, anything to add there?
Well, I just said, I think that at our core, most of our conversations happen with our constituents across our system, and somebody who's worked outside the California community college system, I think sometimes we're a bit blinded by what's happening outside our system. And CBE and CPL are two areas where we've kind of been asleep at the wheel. And what happens is, proprietary institutions, even private nonprofit institutions, have made tremendous strides in this regard. And it's not just this area. We can, enrollment processes and, there's many other areas where they do this business better. And I think it's imperative that if we're going to be competitive in the marketplace for post-secondary opportunities, particularly for adult learners, that we're providing students with the same types of opportunities that they're afforded by our competitors. And so I don't think it's an option, but for us. But more importantly, again, the design of the programs at Trade Tech that Jess spoke to and at continuing education are really aimed at moving folks as quickly as possible into high-paying jobs. And if that's our objective, then this only helps us to get to that end more expediently.
Well said. Thank you. I just looked at the time and we are out of time, even though we just seem to have gotten started. So I just want to, first of all, thank each of you very much for such a rich, content-filled session. And I think taking together the span of work that you guys have been engaged in gives people a very broad picture of possibilities and also the developments that are going on in California. So thank you so much. Adair, thanks for all your technical support. If people look in the chat right now, they'll see that we have a Mentimeter. We'd love some quick feedback, anything, there's opportunity to make comment as well as just give us your feedback. And then also we will put in the links to the next session, your next breakout session. There's a 10-minute break, and then what is that? 11:50, if I've got it right, till noon is the next breakout session. And you just can go in there and find the one you want. You don't have to sign up separately. Just go in there, click on the session that you like. There is one on credit for prior learning that we've touched on. There's one on onboarding, and there's also one on creating cohorts within meta majors. So good luck. We'll see you, some of you, at the next breakout. Take good care. Thank you so much for joining us.